Hello, welcome to Fbnc Smart Money. Now, Vietnam has the lowest ratio of urbanization, but the urbanization speed is among the highest in the region. Therefore, urban housing and house financing have become a very hot topic with a lot of issues that Vietnam is facing right now. So we will be discussing about this special topic in today's program. Joining me now are the two special guests, introducing Professor Richard Pizer from Harvard Graduate School of Design. He is a very well-known professor in the field of real estate, especially in real estate financing. And Mr. Huỳnh Thế Du from Fulbright University, Vietnam. He is the first Vietnamese that has obtained the PhD from Harvard on urban study. Welcome both of you, Mr. Pizer and Mr. Zhu, that has joining our program today. How are you both today?
Fine.
Yes,
so,
fine.
A pleasure to be here.
Thank you very much. And now the urbanization ratio in Vietnam is about 35%, while it is 60% in China and 82% in Korea. But the urbanization speed of Vietnam is very high, with more than 1 million people moving to the city each year. So, Professor Pizer, what could be the most challenging issue in this kind of situation of Vietnam, in your point of view?
Well, the biggest issue, I think, is where these people go when they move into the city, because housing is already tight, and typically the government isn't and can't afford to be providing new housing for them, so they have to move wherever they can, but that puts a big burden on the existing housing stock.
So, Mr. Zhu, you have done a lot of research on informal and formal developments of urbanization. Can you shed some light on this?
So I think, in fact, I have done a number of research about urbanization in Vietnam, housing sector in Vietnam. There are interesting issue in Vietnam is that I think the informal housing have dominant yet in Ho Chi Minh City and other cities in Vietnam for a long time. I think when a lot of people come there, they just try to get some informal housing. And over time, I think informal become everywhere in Vietnam. But I think the good thing is that the government, when the informal housing happen, the government intervene. They try to come in to build some, instead of destroying on some kind of slum or something like that. But the government try to build some infrastructure, providing some services. And it becomes the very, I think, unique housing settlement in Vietnam. The rich and the poor living together. The society very harmonized, harmonious. But I think that situation just happened for a while. When the income become richer and the people want to higher quality of housing. So at that time, the formal housing will be, I think, more important than the current one.
So speaking about formal housing, it is really hard to get one, because you know, the average income of Vietnam is still low, and a lot of poor people that still exist in Vietnam. So one of the way to get a house as such is to get mortgage from the bank. So housing mortgage has becoming popular recently, but it still hasn't fully developed yet. So Mr. Zhu, what is the problem here?
From my knowledge, the first one is because the financial market in Vietnam underdeveloped. So that it needs a lot of things, I think, for our mortgage market to develop. Right. But the financial market in Vietnam is very beginning period. For example, the stock market is still very inactive, not very active enough, and the related market security, I think, is still have not exist or had not developed yet. Maybe Professor Pizer can provide three fundamentals for very vibrant, very vital housing industry or the market.
Yes, Professor Pizer, how can you elaborate here?
Well, the three critical ingredients for a vibrant housing market are first title and access to land, And the reason that title is so important is that you have to be able to perfect or prove title in order for a lender to be able to make a mortgage. Now, I understand one of the advantages in Vietnam compared to other emerging market countries is that most of the land actually does have title, so you don't have the problem that you would in Africa and India, where there are very large areas of informal housing and there's an issue of title. The second key ingredient is this whole area of finance, and that's a complex topic that I'm sure we'll come back to. But the third area also has to do with the regulatory environment and how difficult, costly, and time-consuming it is to get permission to build. So all of those are critical for having a vibrant housing market.
And speaking more about mortgage, a lot of people concerned about income transparency and stability that is, becoming an alarming issues, so that people cannot get a mortgage from the bank. Mr. Zhu, is this a reality?
I think that if we look at the situation in Vietnam, a lot of people complain about the housing price are too high, income too low. But what they happen in reality? Most people, most households, they have house. They live in their house with the value is really high. And in this case, I think the good thing, if the financial market, the credit and mortgage market become more active, more dynamic, a lot of people can have a formal housing, a higher quality of housing. So in reality, they have incomes, but because the nature of our economy, Vietnam economy, there are some problem with informal activity or something like that. So that maybe prevent the development of the mortgage market, the financial market. Because you are right, I think to develop a very dynamic, very active financial market in general and mortgage market, we need system, a transparent market. So at that time, I think right now still a big problem, not only for the mortgage market, but for financial market. Since I have worked for the banks for a long time and have been doing research about financial system in Vietnam for a long time. So that is one of the major issues in Vietnam now.
So one of the keys for a bank to be able to make a mortgage is that they have proof of income.
Yes.
And so if you're not able to demonstrate not only that you have the income, but that you'll have the same income going forward, then it's impossible to get a mortgage. So to the extent people's income is either under the table or what a lot of their income isn't what they report, that's a problem. In the United States, lenders actually ask for tax returns as proof of the income, and of course nobody wants to pay taxes, but that's the way you prove that you have sufficient income to pay for the mortgage.
So Mr. Zhu, because this is still happening here in Vietnam and it has caused a lot of bad debts for the banking system, but over the year, maybe over the last 2 years, the bad debts has already been resolved very nicely. So do you think it is really an effort that we have been, kind of recovering, or it is some kind of,
Yes, I understand what you mean. If we look at the financial markets in Vietnam and the financial sector in Vietnam, there have been a big problem since, I think, the late 1980. So far, if we look at every 10 years, from 1989 to 1999 and 2009, we have some kind of financial crisis. The problem with the banking system, because there are a lot of problems, because the market have not transparent enough, a lot of, I think, inside growth ownership and the credit, I think, lend to somebody, they use, I think, in the different way that the real bank want. So the question right now, whether it would happen next year.
Yes.
Because next year is 2019, after 10 years. So if we look at the situation right now, everything looks pretty good. Right, the stock market have gone up a lot and the real estate market become warmer or something like that, the economy become more vibrant. So, but I think that is a good time to look at. So the government should be careful about that. The buyer, investor should be careful about that. So if the situation happen against next year, so it means the psychology circle happen, it could be big problem for Vietnam. So that is the time for Vietnam, everybody in Vietnam, to watch and to be careful to avoid the circle. So that is from my experience.
Okay, and we will catch up on that, on the roles of the buyers and also the governments in the next part of the program. Thank you very much. We have been talking with Professor Richard Pizer from Harvard Graduate School of Design and Mr. Huỳnh Thế Du from Fulbright University of Vietnam, and we will be returning in the next part of the FBnC Smart Money. Please stay with us. Welcome back to FBnC Smart Money. We've been talking with Professor Richard Pizer from Harvard Graduate School of Design and Mr. Huỳnh Thế Du from Fulbright University of Vietnam, and we have talked about the mortgage market in Vietnam, and we'll be catch up on that in this episode of Smart Money. Welcome back, Professor Pizer and Mr. Zhu. Now we have talked about why the mortgage market is not yet developed in Vietnam and the current situation of it. So, Mr. Zhu, do you think that house financing is sole responsibility of the market or the government?
I think that depends on a lot of components. So in this case, we look at, I think, at least 3 components: the financial system, the financial tools, and the regulatory system. So that is the role of the government, the role of the market, and the role of the buyer, the seller. So it means the supply side, the demand side, and the role of the who make the system, the market work well.
Okay.
So that the 3 main players.
Yes, and speaking about the roles of that 3 players, I was told that Professor Pizer, that in Beijing for over 30 years, the government did not grant any construction license to household, to a person or to any family, but only to the real estate developers. So what does this mean and what can we learn from this?
Well, one, I confess I'm not familiar with that particular policy, but it's not unusual for supply of housing to depend on developers. Typically, if you're giving licenses to individuals, which you can in most parts of the world, but they're building single houses, whereas the objective of the government typically is to provide for a lot more houses, and it's developers who play that function. So I don't know what the system is precluding individuals from getting the right to build single houses, but I do know that China, because of the sheer number of people, that they're even trying to outlaw single-family homes in favor of higher density development. And whenever you have higher density development, you really need a developer to be the one to put all the aspects together.
So Mr. Zhu, in the case of Vietnam, do you think that we should do the same?
I don't think so. Just because I think if the government try to do and try put on the hands of the developer, it will destroy not only I think it will destroy a lot of things. I think the urban fabric, urban density, because it look, I think the social structure in Vietnam it's quite unique. As I mentioned before, I think the harmonious earth society, the rich and the poor living together, individual household, they have their independence. So if the government try to do it, it may good for the formal sector, formal housing sector to develop. It may good for to build a good mortgage market or something like that. But I don't think that is the goals of the government. The goal of the government to help the people to have the happy life. So that is from my viewpoint.
So do you think that with that unique characteristics of Vietnam's market, what the government should do now to help the housing markets?
I think that's the good thing of the informal development, that because the housing is very cheap, very low, it's very affordable. But the problem is that related amenities, related services, I think they are poor. So in this case, the government try to help, try to promote for the formal development. But I think with the low price of lands, low cost of construction or something like that, that's because the procedure is too long. The uncertainty to get the land is too high. So it makes the formal housing become very expensive. So that's the government mistake. The government issue. So in this case, the government should deal with that issue instead of just thinking about to help somebody.
One of the big issues with informal housing is simply the provision of basic infrastructure, especially water and sewer. Now, I understand actually from Du's research on his dissertation that the government has been quite proactive at going into areas of informal housing and installing those that basic infrastructure, which is essential to have sanitation and clean water and to make it more livable. That, however, isn't the long-term fix for housing. I don't believe that stimulating the informal sector is the way you're going to build a decent housing stock. To do that, you really do need to have a very vibrant real estate market, which has sufficient land for development, and a clear process to get that land, and also a transparent process so it doesn't appear that land is just going to cronies of the politicians. And then you need to be able to get approvals to build, and those approvals need to be fast and not too onerous, but still controlling what gets built. And then you need to have capital, money available, both to the developer in the form of construction financing, and then to the ultimate buyers in the form of mortgages to facilitate the ultimate sale of the house.
Yeah, but more from the buyer's perspective, what do you think that we should do, in order to make the system more transparent?
Well, what made the biggest difference in the United States goes back to what happened after World War II, when the government created a national mortgage insurance system, and also made essentially, through the federal FHA, they made mortgages available with very small down payments. And because the government was guaranteeing those mortgages, it meant that lenders were quite willing to make those loans, because if there was a default, then the government would actually make up for the loss. Ironically, there weren't that many losses because the government and the lenders were quite strict about standards for underwriting. And that also had the benefit in terms of the quality of the housing, because if you were a builder who qualified for this FHA financing, you had to build to certain standards. So all these things need to come together really in order to have a very active market.
But Mr. Zhu, in some developed countries, especially in the U.S., tax credit is advantage of mortgage housing. So tax income in Vietnam has becoming popular to many, people that going to work. So do you think that the government should, give some tax credit so that people can be able to buy a house even easier?
I think that's the scenario that may happen in Vietnam in 10 or 20 years. I think for right now, if we look at the number of people who pay personal tax, it's really low. Because as we discussed before, a lot of informal income, but a lot of income cannot be taxed. So if we use tax credit, I think the impact may be really small. So the first one the government should do, I think in this case, that how to make, I think, on income become more transparent, more formal, instead of a lot of kind of income. So that I think the government should focus on that first. So it means try to establish fundamental foundation for the whole society. Because if we look at the financial market, it relies on the basic foundation of the society. Transparency is one of the major. So transparency is a big problem in Vietnam. That is the role of the government. How to make the transparency become better. Because that is the problem is that if I try to report my income, right, I have to pay a lot of tax.
Yes.
In this case, and I got...
want to avoid
that. I got nothing. So if the government can to design some kind of incentive and some kind of enforcement for the citizen to report their income, the income become more formal and more transparent. I think it would be good for Vietnam.
Yeah, and besides that, Professor Pizer, right now, real estate developers in Vietnam are concentrating a lot on building affordable housing. So you think this is the right way to go to satisfy the markets?
Well, you absolutely need affordable housing. Typically, developers don't build affordable housing because they make a lot more money building expensive housing.
Yeah.
And in fact, to deliver affordable housing, often the numbers don't work, so developers can't do it profitably. Now, the way China has done so quite successfully is through a program where they actually make land available to developers for free, developers who promise to build affordable housing, and then the developer in turn is restricted to a very small profit margin, only 3%. But they're willing to do that because, one, they're building a lot of houses so they can make a fair amount of money in total, and they also, by building the affordable housing, they get permission to build other more expensive housing.
But Mr. Zhu, I think it is impossible to do the same in Vietnam.
I think for the Vietnam government have talked for a long time, have a lot of effort about building more affordable housing, for social housing, housing for lower income groups, for government official or something like that. To create a more competitive market, we need more sellers, it means more developers. That is very important. So if a more transparent market, a better financial market would encourage more people join the market.
One of the reforms that has been implemented in China very successfully is to prohibit negotiated sales of land between district governments and developers. That now all sales, transfers of land have to go through an auction process. And so you can't have that close friendship relationship that not only contributes a lot to corruption, but prevents, as Du said, having a more competitive market and a lot more players, which is very desirable.
So we will come back on that and in search of more solutions for Vietnam's situation in the next part when the program returns. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
You are watching Fbnc Smart Money, and we will continue in the next part of the program. Please stay with us. Welcome back to Fbnc Smart Money, and we will continue the discussion with Professor Richard Pizer from Harvard Graduate School of Design and Mr. Huỳnh Thế Du from Fulbright University of Vietnam about affordable housing in cities. Now, welcome back. Professor Pizer, many years ago in state-owned companies in Vietnam, there was a system whereby the company subsidized part of money so that their employee can buy houses. Do you think that we should implement that kind of system right now in Vietnam?
No, I don't. I think the role that state-owned enterprises played historically simply isn't a workable solution in the modern economy. If anything, well, Vietnam is moving in the right direction, I think, to privatize as much of the economy as possible. And unfortunately, as you privatize the companies, on the plus side, they become a lot more efficient, but they also move away from the role of providing all the social services that state-owned enterprises may have historically. So I don't think there's any going back, I'm afraid.
Mr. Zhu, you think the same? And if so, the companies, even private companies, what they can do in order to help their employees to buy a house?
I think in this case we should look at what happened in the past, right? With that policy, a family with 9 members live in a 24 square meter apartment. Yeah. It's good model. I think it's really bad, right? Because the company, it is not the company can do, because any company, they just focus on what they do best. Yes. Mm-hmm. I think providing housing, it belongs to those who can do best on that. Mm-hmm. So that is specialization, right? Okay. So that is the man, that is why Vietnam reform from central planning to more market-based economy, and we get a lot of success. We just follow that, I think, success. Instead of thinking about the old model or something like that. We know that there are a lot of problems, but we can use market solution along with the government policy, subsidize, regulation, and tax, to promote the housing market to be developed healthier. So that is the role of the government. Don't think about the roles of company to provide housing for their employees. Okay. Just give their high salary. And for other people can do that for them. Just
pay them what they deserve, right?
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
But it's also very important, each person who works for a company has different housing preferences and housing needs. Okay. And the only way to meet those needs is through a market system. And the market system actually works quite well, that if there is demand and people with sufficient income to pay for the housing, then smart developers will emerge to meet that demand. Yeah. At the end of the day, you just can't turn the clock back, I'm afraid.
Okay, even though right now the mortgage market in Vietnam is not yet fully developed, but a lot of people is thinking about securitization or secondary mortgage market. So, Mr. Zhu, what is your first thought on this?
I think that I have do research about financial system for a long time and the financial market in Vietnam for a long time. If I just look at the 3 main components, the first one is the financial institutions. The second one, financial tools. And the third one, financial infrastructure. So all those 3 in Vietnam are quite underdeveloped now. So if we try to develop a very vibrant secondary mortgage market, we need a lot of things, right? We need a lot of things. So but the first one, I think, we try to do a primary market become better. Right now, for a long time, the developers, it is very difficult to borrow loan from banks to implement their projects. Because at that time, in fact, the buyers had to contribute to building the projects. Right? Yeah, right now. I think it's that time Professor Pizer may elaborate a little bit about that. But I think if we look at 2 sides, for the home buyers, it's easier to get credit. But for the home builder, developer, in fact, it's very difficult to get healthy and good credit. So, would you like to elaborate a little bit about that?
Well, I think most people don't appreciate the difference between permanent mortgages that home buyers need in order to help pay for their homes versus what we call construction financing that developers need in order to build the project. Now, in mature markets, you do not have a system where the developer looks to down payments by the buyers to provide the cash to build the project. And the government doesn't want to do that, because if something happens to the developer, then those buyers can lose all their money. And instead, the developers look to the banking system to furnish the construction financing, which are short-term loans, and then the bank has a very crucial role to play in monitoring the progress and to make sure that the money that they loan the developer goes into the project. So this will happen over time, but it's an essential ingredient really to have a functioning real estate development market.
And so people still shocked about what has happened in 2008 in the US market. But Mr. Zhu, I understand that right now we need to focus on the primary markets, mortgage markets in Vietnam. But should we start thinking about designing a secondary markets from now so that we can increase the liquidity of the market?
Yes, absolutely. I think Vietnam should think about the secondary market because the secondary mortgage market is very important for a vibrant market. So that is the government, the Vietnam should think about that to build a better financial markets with the secondary one. Because from the mortgage market, stock market, bond markets, and so on.
Interesting. Professor Pizer and Mr. Zhu, thank you very much once again for coming here and share with us a lot of useful information. And we would like to wish you a lot of health and success. And we look forward to seeing you more again in the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Cảm ơn.
So what Professor Pizer and Mr. Huỳnh Thế Du have shared with us in the program, in order to develop the affordable housing to accommodate the urbanization process, we should work on the transparency of the system, especially the financial markets and the financial tools and the infrastructure of the system. So that has wrapped up our Fbnc Smart Money today. Thank you for watching, and we'll be seeing you again in the next episode of Smart Money.